All right, welcome everyone. Today, we're taking a guided tour of one of the most wild and, let's be honest, confusing experiences we all go through, puberty. We're not going to treat it like a boring clinical checklist. Instead, we're going to look at it for what it really is, this absolutely fascinating, totally unique, and powerful journey of transformation. So, let's dive in. Right off the bat, let's just tackle the one question that pretty much everyone asks themselves at some point. It's the one that makes us all feel a little less alone, and it's really the big idea behind our whole tour today. Okay, first up, the starting line. Before anything you can see happens, there's this quiet, invisible signal, kind of like a starting gun, that fires off and kicks the whole thing into gear. So think of this whole process like mission control launching a rocket. Your brain's hypothalamus, that's the flight director. It sends out the secret launch code, a hormone called GnRH. The pituitary gland gets that code and boom, it launches two key hormones, LH and FSH. You can think of these as the booster rockets that travel down to the gonads, the ovaries or the testes, and basically tell them it's go time. Start pumping out that estrogen and testosterone. It's this simple but incredibly powerful three-step chain reaction that gets this whole journey started. So once mission control has sent the launch codes, what happens next? Well, let's look at the very first physical changes. This is where we really start to see how everybody's individual journey can look so different. And check this out, this is fascinating. Even though the hormonal start is pretty much the same for everyone, the physical starting point is often different. A huge study found that for the vast majority of boys, we're talking over 91%, genital development is the very first sign. For girls, it's a bit more of a mix, but for a solid majority, about 2/3, breast development kicks things off before anything else. To try and make sense of all these changes, scientists came up with what are called the Tanner stages. And what you're seeing here is a simplified version. Think of it like a very general roadmap, just outlining the usual sequence of events. But, and this is the key thing to remember, it is just a guide. Everyone's timing, their pace, it's all completely unique. Stage 1 is before anything starts, and stage 5 is when you've reached your adult height. Everything in between, well, that's your own personal tour. Next up, probably one of the most dramatic parts of the whole tour, the growth spurt. That time when it feels like you're literally outgrowing your clothes overnight. So what this chart shows is the typical window for what scientists call peak height velocity, which is just a fancy way of saying the time you're growing the absolute fastest. And you can see a pretty clear difference, right? For girls, that peak usually hits somewhere between 9.5 and 11.5 years old. For boys, it's a little later, typically between 11.5 and 12.5. And that brings us to a really simple but super significant number. On average, girls hit their biggest growth spurt about 2 years earlier than boys do. And that one little fact explains that classic middle school phenomenon where, for a little while, many of the girls are taller than the boys. Okay, so we've looked at the hormones and the physical stuff, but our tour would not be complete if we didn't talk about one of the most important and yet totally invisible parts of puberty. The massive construction project happening inside the brain. Now, this is where things get really wild. Using brain scans, researchers found something they did not expect at all. While going through puberty, key brain networks that are involved in mood and emotion actually start developing in opposite directions for boys and girls. In boys, the lines of communication, the functional connectivity between these areas actually gets stronger, but in girls, that very same connectivity gets weaker. Now, of course, we've got to be careful here. As the lead researcher, Dr. Monique Ernst, points out, they found this incredible correlation, but they don't know for sure why. The next big step is figuring out exactly how these brain changes might be linked to all the emotional shifts that happen during these years. It's a really exciting and pretty new area of science. And that leads us perfectly into the next stop on our tour, which is all about connecting the dots, connecting the body, the brain, and the whole emotional experience of puberty. So to really get this connection, we need to know two key terms. The first is pubertal status. That's just where you are in the process at any given moment. It's the how much. How much have you developed? But then there's pubertal timing, and that's all about when you get there compared to your friends. And it turns out a lot of the research shows that this when can be just as important, if not more important, than the how much. Okay, so let's build out a little chain reaction that researchers have started to piece together. For some girls, the whole thing starts with what we just talked about, early pubertal timing, so developing physically before most of their friends. Now, being in that social situation, developing earlier than your peers, can sometimes lead to something called rumination. And what is that? Well, it's basically when your brain gets stuck in a loop, just passively and repeatedly focusing on negative feelings and what those feelings might mean. And that tendency to get stuck in that loop, well, that can become a bridge to a higher risk for depression. This pathway helps us understand, at least in part, why we start to see a real difference in depression rates between boys and girls during adolescence. It's just a powerful example of how our biology and our social world can interact. So as we get to the end of our tour here, let's pull all these pieces together and really focus on the big takeaways from this journey. Why does all of this matter? Let's recap the highlights. First, and this is maybe the most important thing, puberty is a journey with your own personal timetable. It is not a race. Variation isn't the exception, it's the rule. Second, all those invisible changes happening in the brain are just as profound and significant as the ones you can see in the mirror. And finally, understanding how the body's timing, the brain's rewiring, and our emotional world are all connected, well, that's everything. And that leaves us with one final big question to chew on. Because this isn't just about biology, right? It's a deeply human experience. So, knowing that every single person's journey is unique, how can we all do a better job of talking about it? How can we make the conversation about puberty more supportive, more informed, and just more empathetic for everyone?